icons, the man behind the mask, plus why fat comedians rule. Chapter 1: The Beginning of a Legend. The unexpected journey from bike cop to training killers. Where do I begin? One day, I was patrolling the streets on my trusty two wheeler, enforcing the law on pedals stroke at a time. And the next, I was training some of the most notorious horror movie killers in history. That's right, folks. A bike cop turned horror movie legend trainer. I know what you're probably thinking. Did someone accidentally leave the door to an alternate universe wide open? Well, let me assure you, the universe takes occasional smoke breaks, and that's where I found myself on my unexpected journey. Back in my bike cop days, I didn't know the difference between a machete and a garden hoe. My daily grind consisted of pulling over elderly cyclists for not wearing helmets. Seriously, you won't believe how feisty grandmas can get when you try to enforce safety rules. Yes, little did I know, those days were merely training wheels on the path to my true destiny. Picture it: a chubby bike cop cruising down the streets dreaming of future glories, while simultaneously collecting stray pets and dubious amounts of ticket revenue. The dream. It all changed when I stumbled upon a casting call flyer while munching on both ironically and prophetically a half loaf sandwich. Yes, the half loaf, my glorious invention for single folks who can't commit to an entire loaf of bread, because honestly, who has time for that? Anyway, the flyer was about a horror icons needing a little coaching. One look at it, and I could almost hear the haunting sound of victory playing in my ears. It promised to be a journey into the belly of the horror beast, and I figured, what do I have to lose? After all, at this point in my life, my biggest challenge was figuring out how to keep my son Brad from constantly teasing me about my Subaru. So there I was, sitting in a dimly lit community theater, waiting for my first audition. The smell of stale popcorn mixed with bargaining potential filled the air. That's when I met Jason Voorhees. Yes, the actual Jason. Now imagine my shock when I realized that while I was stammering about arm positioning and breathing control, he was just silently staring with that ominous mask. Was it a mask, or was that his actual face? On second thought, perhaps it doesn't matter. However, his silent demeanor made me feel right at home. Training Jason was like teaching a walrus to do ballet. I mean, sure, he could kill a guy with a single swoosh of the machete, but he often had problems with the double pirouette. Talk about a challenge. I distinctly remember a day when I attempted to get him to practice cutting in during a group exercise. A classic move I learned while landing my own significant role in the local community theater interpretation of Grease. On cue, Jason took a slice out of my favorite lawn gnome instead. Right then, I understood that getting a killer to embrace the art of movement would involve more than just choreography. It required patience, creativity, and more than a few band aids. Over time, I accumulated more horror icons like stamps on a passport. Michael Myers, Leatherface, you name it. Each one came with their array of quirks. And trust me, psychology wasn't merely an optional class. It was like mastering a dangerous game where the players wielded knives, axes, and whatever axes are made of. Who knew that creating an unforgettable villains would demand a level of insight usually reserved for therapists and overzealous Regis hairstylists? So here I was, a bike cop who had gone from fishing stray dogs out of bushes to literally shaping the future of horror villains, all while riding in my Subaru, battling existential crises about my career choices. The truth is, my journey from chasing down bicycle thieves to molding cinematic monstrosities was more twisted than a plot line of one of those low budget slasher flicks. But honestly, isn't that what makes life absurdly wonderful? You never know when the universe will lend you a machete and say, It's your turn to carve your path. Just do me a favor. Make sure you have a solid training regimen in place before you start swinging. The lessons learned from the streets. The art of pursuit. The art of pursuit. Sounds thrilling and tantalizing, doesn't it? Let me clarify right now. There's nothing quite like chasing down a criminal on a bike and trying to maintain your dignity while your feet go into a full blown jazzercise routine. Who knew that pedaling faster than greased lightning while sweating profusely would prepare me for the horror movie training camp? But believe me when I say, some priceless lessons can be gleaned from those law enforcement days that just might outrun any horror film chase scene. So there I was, a bike cop in my neon getup that would blind a possum at midnight. The job came with its benefits: an occasional scene of heroism, feeling extra eco friendly, and of course, meeting some colorful characters. I once had to pursue a fellow on a unicycle stealing my half loaves. If that's not a scene from a comedy horror, I don't know what is. But those pursuits taught me more than just how to go fast. They taught me strategic patience, a skill that every horror villain trainer should take to heart. Much like Yoke Jason battling his way through a glitzy prom night, ingredients like precision, timing, and a dash of unpredictability dictate the outcome of the chase. Picture me chasing down a guy weaving in and out of traffic like a caffeinated squirrel on a sugar high. One moment, you think you're about to corner them, and the next they've vanished into thin air as if they were practicing for the next big magic show. It was in these moments of forced cardio that I learned the importance of strategy. You don't just chase, you anticipate. You've got to predict the moves, understand the terrain, and above all, keep your eyes peeled for erratic changes, like how my son Brad changes his favorite brand every week. That's right. Kids these days are like chameleons on roller skates. Training killers in the world of horror is rather similar, believe it or not. I found that molding a horror icon requires a nuanced understanding of perspective. A good trainer can't go after performances. They must understand the motivations, the fears, and yes, even the cravings for vengeance akin to that moment I had when someone again tried to swipe my half loaf at the grocery store. So when I'm working with Jason, the layers I peel back are not just about teaching him to swing the machete. They involve understanding his traumatic backstory, perhaps over a few coffees in an all-night diner. Now that's some heavy-duty therapy. Then there's the art of stealth. Ah, stealth. The quiet dance of horror. Pursuit on a bike taught me that fine art of being unnoticed. You can't just bumble into a criminal space, waving your arms and grumbling like a bike tire with a slow leak. No, no. It's all about that smooth gliding action. In horror, this translates beautifully when bringing villains to life. Michael Myers, for instance, has perfected this art. Moving swiftly, appearing suddenly, and then execute the reveal like a magician pulling a rabbit out of a top hat. Let's talk about endurance, an absolute must. You see, during my tenure as a bike cop, I learned valiant feats of endurance were essential. Not only did I have to keep my legs in shape, I also had a surreal ability to stand strong against all temptations, especially when my favorite food truck was parked just one street over. But endurance is equally crucial when it comes to training a horror icon. We are talking about hours of rehearsal, getting them into shape without so much as a whimper. It's like making sure that a well cooked roast doesn't let out a sad little gas bubble. You've got to hold it all together until the very moment it's ready to shine on screen. Ultimately, the streets molded me into the trainer I am today. Each sweaty pursuit taught me resilience, foresight, and the profound art of anticipating every twisted turn. You know that chasing down criminals could segue seamlessly into shaping horror icons. As I ride my trusty Subaru, I chuckle to myself, thinking those surreal days when I was out to save the world and my lunch. The truth is, the street is an unpredictable teacher, and if there's one lesson to share, it's this: never underestimate the power of your pursuit, or you might find yourself with a new villain in training. And let's just say, I'm glad I didn't lose my focus. Some scary creatures walk among us, and they might just be waiting for their big break. The first encounter with horror icons. My first encounter with horror icons, a tale woven with both dread and delightful absurdity, it was like stepping into an alternate dimension where nightmares come to life, yet sprinkled with the humor that I'd usually reserve for family gatherings. You see, one moment I was within the delightful confines of my comfort zone, while that would be my Subaru and a half loaf sandwich. And the next, I was wandering around backstage at a horror film convention. Think of it as Disneyland for people who find joy in the often unsettling realm of macabre. You know that horror and hilarity could collide in such a spectacular fashion. I still remember walking into the convention center and being greeted by a cacophony of voices, moans, and the sounds of various props clattering on the floor. There was enough fake blood to fill a small pool, and the air was heavy with a mix of anticipation and nachos. Ah, yes, the secret ingredient creativity. My heart raced as I navigated the throngs of fans in homemade costumes that really brought a new meaning to wearing your heart on your sleeve. A fan dressed as Freddy Krueger was innocently munching on a giant pretzel while discussing his latest dream stabbing theories with a fellow attendee who appeared deeply concerned. This was my new reality. Then, bam! Suddenly, there he was, Jason Voorhees, towering like a refrigerator made of muscle and menace. And let me tell you, when you see a guy whose main fashion statement is a hockey mask, your first instinct isn't to ask him for a selfie. It's more like, can I borrow the machete for a second? Now, Jason was not ready for our encounter. I mean, he has this reputation for being out of touch with emotions. This guy hasn't even responded to my emotional text messages. But there I stood, staring at the embodiment of horror, feeling remarkably underdressed in my fried green tomato t shirt. The first thing I managed to squeak out was, I trained you, as if that would somehow inflate my ego while also making Jason realize he should recognize my brilliance by bowing down and declaring me the overlord of horror training. But instead, he just tilted his head, made that significant slow motion step forward. It was this moment I realized my instinctual fear response kicked in, and I momentarily forgot how many calories were in a half loaf. I wondered if running away would count as cardio. Next, of course, was the inevitable interaction with Michael Myers, who, truth be told, looked a bit like the kid from the neighborhood who showed up at my door asking for candy once too often. He got this iconic blank mask that makes you look disturbingly relatable. At At the time, I had to summon every ounce of focus I engaged in the conversation filled with existential, philosophical dread. What's it like being a killer? I asked, hoping for a Michael Scott esque moment of revelation. All I got in return was a heavy silence, much like my son when I tried to explain the themes of Goodfellas to him. He just glares at me like I'm trying to speak Klingon. Now, there was a particular moment that stands out. I was attempting to give a motivational speech, channeling the essence of Oprah, but the horror icons looked more bewildered than inspired. They seemed to be processing my words, yet simply stood there, motionless in that iconic stillness, as if they were trapped between worlds, a terrifying horror flick in a stand-up routine. The juxtaposition was more potent than a cheap horror film featuring a mad scientist attempting to become a stand-up comedian. I was only halfway I was only half aware that at any moment someone might scream. Though to be fair, at that point I was just hoping it wasn't me. The climax of this surreal interaction was when I realized that it was not enough to train horror icons merely as villains. You've got to break down those layers and uncover the surreal absurdity we often overlook. Here were these masked figures, crafted into life to terrify audiences. Yet at this moment, they looked like overgrown kids trying to find joy in a game they were forced to play. I cautiously stepped away, realizing that not only had I encountered my fears, but I also bonded with them on a level I didn't fully understand. As I made my way out of the room, filled with mass terror and inexplicable laughter, I couldn't help but chuckle at how bizarrely fitting the first encounter had been. These legendary figures weren't just my future training projects. They were reflections of the odd journey I had embarked upon, a bike cop turned trainer of horror legends. My heart laughed at how I had crossed into their world, and in that moment, I understood something profoundly simple. Horror is just a comedy dressed in blood, with a soundtrack of wild screams, and that's the beauty of it. Decoding the psychology of a killer. Decoding the psychology of a killer is a task that could put fraud and the entire cast of CSI, whatever city, to shame. It's not just about the masks and the big knives. Let me be clear, having a substantial weapon collection does add a flair of drama. Staring into the psychological abyss of horror icons, you begin to understand that they're not just mindless monsters lurking in the shadows. They're complicated, well, individuals. Think back to my bike cop days. You'd think I was prepared for this. After all, spending hours on the streets exposed to the peculiarities of humanity could make you feel like you're subtitling an independent film about life's oddities. Take Jason Voorhees, for instance. On the surface, he's just a hulking figure in a mask with a penchant for machete work. But scratch a little deeper, and you find a boy who was wronged by fate and some careless camp counselors who just couldn't follow safety procedures 101. While during the training session, I tried to channel my inner psychiatrist, assuming the role of a nightmare therapist trying to pry open those emotional floodgates. Jason, I exclaimed, how about you talk about your feelings? Wait, is there even a word for the equivalent of therapist induced heart palpitations? Because watching him bite into a prop sandwich in silence sent chills down my spine. Anyone who could successfully eat silently while holding machete deserves a trophy. Then there's Michael Myers, the poster child for psychological study courses everywhere. The blankness of the mask is haunting. But we have to remember that behind it is a guy with a less than cordial upbringing and an obsession with staring contests that would put cordial upbringing and an obsession with staring contests that would put Olympic athletes to shame. In our training sessions, I often tried to motivate him by blending strategies and video game tactics. Dude, channel your inner gamer. There's a point system behind every kill. But alas, he merely stared, the mask not betraying even a glimmer of excitement. I can't help but ponder. If he had opened up to me for a moment about his childhood, would he have transformed into a lovable guy who makes peanut butter sandwiches and volunteers at the local animal shelter instead of trying to carve people into confetti? Attempting to decode a killer's psyche is akin to deciphering the motivations of a teenage son. One moment they seem like a responsible human being, and the next, they're blasting their music at midnight while contemplating the meaning of life from the comfort of their bedroom. In many ways, horror villains are just extroverts looking for attention, struggling with how to express their needs in a world that throws constraints at them like it's the Olympics. The surfacing notion of fear, control, and those pesky emotions we often suppress in favor of cool exterior. That's where the real work begins. As I led these legendary figures through emotional turmoil, workshops disguised as movement exercises, I realized they looked at their trauma like I did with workout sessions, a necessary evil that needs to be endured. You bond with each killer while helping them comprehend that the world isn't just about carnage and shadows. It's about finding your placement in a world that often feels determined to throw you a fast curveball when all you want is a slow pitch. Channel the rage into training, scream less, chop more, I advised between gulps of energy drinks while crossing my fingers that they wouldn't realize I was ultimately just winging it. Of course, with every knife wielding lunatic I encountered, I started developing an accurate awareness of how tapping into their unique quirks could make them more relatable. Wouldn't it be delightful if you baked cookies instead? I quipped, as everyone nodded along, not comprehending my whimsical suggestion. At its core, I wanted them to find a redemption story among the chaos, to embrace the concept that even monsters deserve moments of reflection, maybe with a side of milk and cookies. As I reflected on these interactions, I began to see a common thread. Beneath the propensity for violence was a deep seated desire for connection, validation, and above all, understanding. I'd swap my career as a bike cop for the chance to mold monsters into multifaceted beings. Instead of butchered hulks, I imagined them as hapless dads trying to navigate a grocery store for the first time. In the end, while I would still have a soft spot for costumes and polyester slasher films that grace the silver screen, my newfound understanding pushes me to uncover the nuances shrouding these killers. Perhaps they're not as far removed from humanity as they appear. After all, and every killer's psyche is just a glimmer of what it means to be beautifully broken. Perhaps we all just need a little therapy, and maybe a solid half loaf sandwich after a long day of existential horror. The training regimen, sculpting iconic villains. Welcome to the world of horror hero training. If you ever wondered how a masked manic becomes a slashing legend, you're in for a treat. Sculpting iconic villains is not just about teaching them how to swing machete or perform the lurking skills like an overzealous cat. It's an art form akin to sculpting marble or trying to convince your kid to finish their veggies, both challenging but equally rewarding. When I first welcomed these villains into my training regimen, there was an air of sober seriousness that enveloped the room. Think serious drama lifted from a soap opera, but with more chainsaws. Jokes aside, the initial few sessions were less about horror and more about establishing trust. How do you get a hulking figure in a mask like Michael Myers to warm up to you? Did I mention warming up? Well, throw the idea out because he was never capable of warming up to anything, not even a Cabbage Patch doll. But my goal was clear, to mold them into not so terrifying killing machines. My regimen began with fitness, which is essential but can be tricky. Most of the iconic figures already had legs gains that would rival a weightlifter right after a protein shake binge. I once suggested a light cardio warm up of sorts, mere laps around the training ground to loosen up. Jason, however, promptly took that as a challenge to proceed to sprint faster than I thought possible, all while swinging his machete with the grace of a ballet dancer trying to impress at a high school prom. Honestly, I half expected him to burst out into a dance routine. This is why I train killers, I shouted. It was less proclamation of pride and more an admission into a surreal lifestyle. Next came the combat training, and Lord help me, I needed a stronger pair of running shoes. We used practice dummies, which to my horror were oddly lifelike, like something from a bizarre Halloween sale, but with a more riveting backstory. I spent countless hours teaching them the nuances of violence and effective weapon handling, along with the importance of postural alignment to preserve those nasty back strain injuries. Wouldn't you know? But even the most dangerous killers need to take self care into account. A villain with an aching back is a villain ready to resort to aftercare in their cozy, dim-lit lair. To add an element of surprise into the training, we initiated many simulated attack scenarios. This meant crafting Fox scenarios that cleverly mimicked popular horror film tropes. Who doesn't love a well placed jump scare? Once I created an elaborate mock up of a spooky cabin. Being resourceful in a training space is crucial. As it turns out, watching Leatherface attempt to cut through a cardboard wall made me wonder if his weapon skills are more for show than practicality. The man knows how to cut a ribbon, but struggles with plywood. Classic. Perhaps one of the most enlightening sessions was teaching them the psychological aspect of villainy. I would vamp up my energy for role play sessions where they had to embody the sensation of fear, tapping into that deep well of angst that every masked killer must possess. Channel that inner angst, I encouraged, and slowly but surely, ideas began to surface. Michael once managed to generate a suspenseful vibe by literally standing still for a full 10 minutes. Honestly, it was a feat worth capturing on film. Equal parts terrifying and comically awkward. I personally wouldn't want to be caught in an elevator with him after mentioning the wrong taco truck. By the end of our training regimen, we had transformed these horror icons, molding them into just killing machines but complex characters. The epic culmination was preparing for their grand debut in a film scene. I crafted a full timeline for their careers, helping them realize that they could transition from being a mere killer to a cultural icon. Imagine Jason melting hearts in castings with a book called Love and Machete. Not only would it sell like hotcakes, but it would also surprise the audience. Who knew he was an avid fan of self-help literature? When I reflected on that journey, I can't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Sculpting iconic villains is more than just a job. It's a wild ride filled with humor, chaos, and undercurrents of unexpected connection. The inherent hilarity in these interactions remind us that underneath all the masks, chainsaws, and red spattered wardrobes, they were still in pursuit of growth, just in their uniquely monstrous ways. After all, if you can train a killer convincingly, you can almost do anything, even convince your child to eat vegetables. Now, if only I could teach Jason to host cooking classes. Imagine the possibility. From laughs to screams, how comedy influences terror. Comedy and horror, and dynamic duo that gets my heart racing and my side splitting, sometimes simultaneously. You might wonder how the gentle art of making people laugh translates into an all out rampage of terror. And believe me, the answer is more complex than getting my son Brad to clean his room. At its core, both genres tap into the primal elements of human emotion, and they both create reactions. Both, be it laughter or downright shrieking. My journey shaping monsters has convinced me that nothing can make the audience scream louder than the punchline they don't see coming. One could argue that comedy is the funneling point for horror. It's that buildup of tension that leads to a gut punching release of laughter, followed by the, oh my gosh, what was that cat just lurking behind the curtain? Kind of scream. I mean, think of the classic plays where you're on the edge of your seat laughing away, but then something dark skitters across the stage, and suddenly it's like you're just smacked awake from the coziest of dreams. This blend of suspense and absurdity is what makes life and horror worth living. All I'm saying is that if you can make your audience chuckle first, the following scream hits twice as hard. Take, for instance, my training with Jason Voorhees. Yes, that very man with a machete who seems forever focused on more ominous pursuits than comedy clubs. As we'd run through rehearsals, I'd sprinkle laughter into the mundane, All right, Jason. When you enter a scene, try to do it like you're sliding into home base. I'd shout as playfully mimicked them sliding through the grass. Hilariously, he didn't seem to share my joy. However, that's just a part of the charm. The comedy reinforced our rhythm, and before long, we turned on ominous entrance into something that resembled a very confused Scooby Doo episode. Horror films are often exploit surprise, and what better surprise than laughter? Think back to those slasher films that almost lull you into a sense of comfort, typically featuring that one quick buddy providing comic relief. Before the unexpected twist that sends the brutal fighting soaring through the audience. I mean, movies like Scream thrived on this very formula, mixing snarkily commentary about horror conventions and a killer who lurked behind the chatty banter of teenagers. Laughter softens the blow, leaving your audience vulnerable and wide eyed when the terror hits. I even made a note to remind my horror icons that ridiculous dialogues could create memorable tension. Who knew a well timed pun could slice tension thicker than leather? Then there's the practical side of comedy in my workshops. They serve as icebreakers. Picture this: Jason and I preparing for a rehearsal. I wanted to loosen the tension, so I whipped out an old joke. Why don't skeletons fight each other? I paused for effect, but before delivering the punchline. They don't have the guts. I barely got the word guts out when he let out an unexasperated sigh and an eye roll that, realistic or not, had all the expression of a high school teenager. It was utter hilarity. The laughter that bounced around the room created an unexpected layer of familiarity. Even a killer thrives on the little moments. A reminder that underneath the mask, there lies a longing for connection and shared experience. One cannot underestimate the power of humor when preparing for the dark moments. Think about those classic horror sequences where tension reaches a peak and viewers know something dreadful is about to unfold. It's in those moments that comedy impact is felt. The giggles from the audience go quiet. Heartbeats are synchronized with the rhythm of the scene, and suddenly there's that striking moment of horror. It's as if the comedic setup became a springboard for chills, creating a whiplash between emotions that leave the audience reeling in delight and dread. In the end, it becomes crystal clear. Laughter and terror complement one another. They elevate storytelling, make twisted tales richer through the juxtapositions of joy and fright. As I observed my horror icons while integrating comedy into our session, I couldn't help but think of every villain's life could use a dash of humor. After all, would Michael truly terrify if he hadn't embraced the absurdity? Perhaps he needs a sitcom called Being Myers to influence personal growth and explore the issues of connection in a world of slaughter. So remember this: in the savage world of horror, laughter isn't just a tool, it's a bridge connecting a shared human experience in the most unlikely of ways. Stand ups and slays, it's a wild ride, and one I'm currently certainly grateful to strap into my journey of molding terrifying legends. So if you see a masked figure racing towards you, you might want to ask yourself, is it time to chuckle or scream? Perhaps it's a little bit of both. The Hopecast Network has reached out to MTD for further questioning upon this reading. His whereabouts are currently unknown at this time.